My Patreon member's current terminal subclade is I-FTA22684, which dates to around 1471 CE. In the database thus far, there are two separate patronyl lines that claim Finland for their earliest known patronyl country of origin, which includes my Patreon member. So most likely, this subclade originated in Finland. Whenever I hear of a haplogroup I-1 kit that claims Finland for the earliest known patronyl country of origin, the first thought to pop in my head is subclade IL-287. The reason being is that 2 out of 3 people that are positive for IDF29 and list Finland for the earliest known patronyl country of origin are also positive for this Iron Age branch, which most likely entered Finland from Sweden during the Iron Age. And because of a proficient progenitor, there are a lot of people in Finland today who are positive for this subclade. That being said, though, my Patreon member is part of that other 1/3 that also claims Finland for an earliest known patronyl country of origin, but has a different patrilineal story to tell than IL-287. During the late Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, most people that are positive for haplogroup I-1 would have had patrilineal forefathers living in the regions that are shaded in red. And this applies to my Patreon member as well. My Patreon member is positive for a very proficient Bronze Age branch labeled IP109. IP109 is a very proficient branch with a lot of downstream subclades that have a strong correlation with Scandinavia and the Viking Age. Ancient DNA samples positive for this branch were found in Salme, Estonia, associated with the Swedish Vikings, Oxford, England, associated with the Danish Vikings, and Iceland, associated with the Norse Vikings. That being said, though, there is no one-size-fits-all theory for any branch of that size from the Bronze Age. There are also continental European ancient DNA samples positive for IP109 that predate the Viking Age, such as the one sample that is associated with the Lombards that was discovered in Pannonia, Hungary. Interestingly, my Patreon member has 4 subclades dating to the Iron Age that all date within 100 years of each other, alluding to a very proficient progenitor from this time period. My Patreon members' most closely related ancient DNA samples thus far branch apart from him during the Iron Age with these proficient progenitors. And these samples are discussed in the 2020 study, Population Genomics of the Viking World. My Patreon member branched apart from VK176, also known as Oxford 20, around 57 CE. In regards to these ancient DNA samples from Oxford, to quote the supplemental information from the study, quote, documentation points strongly towards these men being the Danish victims of King Ethelred's decree ordering their extermination in AD 1002, end quote. He branches apart from VK320, also known as Bogove S, around the year 7 CE. VK320 was discovered in Bogove, Langeland, Denmark during the Viking Age. Langeland is the island of Denmark that is shaded in red. Lastly, he branches apart from VK165, also known as Oxford 3, around the year 28 BCE. VK165 was also a victim of the St. Brice's Day massacre in Oxford, England. So my Patreon members' 3 most closest ancient DNA samples who branched apart from his patrilineal line during the Iron Age were most certainly Danes and Danish Vikings. That being said, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that my Patreon members' forefathers ever lived in Denmark. The reason being is that it is theorized that the Danes lived in southern Sweden during the Iron Age prior to emigrating westward into Denmark later on. So it is at this moment in time during the Iron Age where my Patreon members' patrilineal forefathers could have shared common patrilineal ancestors with these ancient DNA samples from Denmark. At this point in time, with the data that we have, there is no way of knowing for sure if my Patreon members' forefathers were ever living in Denmark amongst the Danes, or if they were in Sweden the whole time prior to emigrating to Finland. What we do know, though, is there is a large time gap of around 1,400 years of missing information between his Iron Age subclade dating to around 57 CE and his current terminal subclade, which dates to around 1471 CE. So there's a lot of possibilities that could have occurred during that large time gap. One possibility is an emigration from either Denmark or Sweden to Finland during the Viking Age, because Finland would have been a stop along the Varangian trade routes. That being said, though, the 2020 study noticed a much stronger Swedish-like presence in Finland than a Danish-like presence. So if we have a Viking influence in Finland, it would have most likely have been a Swedish Viking influence. It's also important to note that regions of Finland were under Swedish rule for approximately 700 years between the 12th and 19th centuries. So you could easily have a Swedish influence entering Finland for my Patreon members' patrilineal line, leading up to his terminal subclade in the 15th century. One such possible Swedish influence could be Sweden's Second Crusade, led by the famous Birger Jarl of the House of Bjälbo against the Tavestians of Finland, where my Patreon member can trace his earliest known patrilineal ancestors. My Patreon member has a very slow STR mutation rate, which leads to a lack of divergence between himself and other people in the database, which leads to more false matches. For example, he has a Y111 match, genetic distance of 10, who through SMP testing, we learn that their earliest known common patrilineal ancestor is the IS14887 branch, which dates to 871 BCE. So this patrilineal connection is several millennia old. He has the most Y67 matches that I've ever seen, with 633. But I put matches in parentheses because the vast majority are false matches. What that means is the patrilineal connection is older than a genealogical time frame. That being said, though, he does have at least a couple promising leads at the Y67 level. He has two exact matches with a genetic distance of 0 that both claim Finland for their earliest known patrilineal country of origin. If they were to upgrade to Big Y700, perhaps they could form a new subclade more recently in time than his current terminal subclade, which dates to the 15th century, or maybe they might even form a subclade older than his current terminal subclade. Thanks for watching.